stand. And our discussion moderator or leader is Jennifer Klein, and who, as you also probably all know, is a professor of American history at Yale University and has been helping us with discussions about movies related to racial justice in America. And I had never seen this one before, so I'm looking forward to our discussion because I found it very powerful and interesting, and both nostalgic and currently relevant. So does anybody have any questions before we begin? And John, are you able to mute everybody?
In Alabama, they were trying to unionize against Amazon. What happened there?
Today? I don't know.
The vote just closed yesterday, so I assume it'll take a week to count the vote. So, yes. They had about a month and a half to mail in the ballots.
Wow. Yeah, I saw something with Jeff Bezos's picture today, but I didn't have a chance to read the article, so I don't know if anything happened. Okay, so Jennifer, do you want to start us off?
Yes, thank you. And it's really nice of so many people to tune in again. I feel like we have an ongoing conversation now with our film series. I don't intend to give a presentation. We're really going to just discuss the film. So I guess I'll just highlight some of the themes that really come through in using this particular story to think about the meaning of civil rights, especially in terms of intersecting with economic rights and economic democracy. This is very much a film about the meaning of work and the connections between work and citizenship, the connections between political democracy and economic rights, and the way in which struggles for freedom are waged. And, this film starts off in a very particular, both local context, but also a particular social history context. It doesn't start with Martin Luther King. It starts with both the city and introducing us to what kind of place it seemed like in the both imagination and in the social reality Memphis was, and to the way that African Americans who lived there experienced it. So I can just have us pose questions. Shoshana, did you want to break it up into two groups, or we'll just stay in one group?
Well, what do you think? And I would ask John, who's a lot more experienced with this, what do you think for size for discussion? Should we break into two groups, or should we try and have a group discussion?
I mean, yeah, I guess I should ask everybody else. Do you feel like, people can get into the conversation when we have a 20-person group here?
I think what would be helpful would be to get the conversation started. So identify some themes, get things started. And then once people have a chance to sort of figure out what the major themes are, then we can break into groups.
Okay. And I also received some questions ahead of time from someone else. And so I think we can start there in terms of the way the film introduces us to the place of Memphis, and how it's both an ideological place, the kind of what kind of culture whites perceived as characterizing Memphis, and what kind of culture Blacks who live there perceived as characterizing Memphis, and why both, I think, people who speak and people who have written about this moment have used the term plantation mentality in talking about Memphis in this period.
Yeah, I was really struck by the, particularly the footage of the like the girls, the debutante balls or whatever you would call them, where the girls were being paraded down in their ball gowns, and it felt very, very. I know things like that probably still exist, but in the South and the way they were, it felt very retro and antebellum, and of course was in a pretty stark contrast to the way the African Americans were living, barely kind of scraping by. So it definitely felt like it had a lot of echoes of the plantation lifestyle. And also the sense of paternalism about the workers. I mean, we'll get into that more, I'm sure, but that was another thing that felt very plantation-esque, of like, we need to we need to kind of take care of these people because they're not fully adult, self-sufficient folks, on the part of the white bosses or mayor or, the various people who spoke, also had a plantation mentality, to my mind.
Yeah, who would like to add on to that? Carol.
It was, I also noticed the parade where the white people were dressed up in blackface.
Oh, yeah.
And to further put people down, put the Black people down. Yeah, I also, this is more about the workers, but their clothes and how the sanitation workers, you could tell a sanitation worker by his big jackets and his big shoes, because they all got hand-me-downs and nothing fit. But yeah, definitely an underclass.
Ruth. Oh, you're on mute.
When they were interviewing the citizens early in the film, one young woman was referring to them, when you pet people, she uses the word pet. We can't pet them. They're going to be spoiled if we pet. That's so derogatory.
Yeah, Cynthia.
So I was struck by how much it seems like what's happening today. There was the scene when it said, if you can't live without welfare, if you have a full-time job and you can't live without welfare, something's wrong. And of course, today we have a situation where you have families with two jobs. I mean, at that point, they may have only been referring to one wage earner or two. I don't know. That's a question for you, Jennifer. But no one lives without, at these levels of employment, without food stamps, at least, and heat assistance and various kinds of welfare. So it seems like no progress. So that's one comment. The other comment I had was how insular people seem. Like the mayor had his group of friends and they all told him he was doing a great job. So he was doing a great job. Okay. So
yeah, and a couple of things. So we see the way in which there are these sort of enactments of ideology, these performances, first of all, of the Old South, as shown on the floats, not only with the blackface, but one of the floats had a plantation manor and a woman in a big 19th century hoop dress. All of those floats were these pictures of the Old South. And so every year they're continually reenacting this ideology of plantation South. And then the other thing is with the, in that era, first of all, public employees had not been covered by the National Labor Relations Act of the New Deal, by the Wagner Act, or pretty much any of the other labor legislation of the New Deal. And so they're outside of all those rights that had been established: the minimum wage, the 40-hour work week, overtime, collective bargaining. And so workers who worked in hospitals, in nursing homes, who worked as custodians in various public institutions, or who worked in the sanitation department, were making, these rock bottom wages, were seen, as Shoshana was saying, like the servants for the city. And in turn, no, they couldn't make it on a paycheck. But the way that public assistance often functioned in these settings is, can you recall the image that we saw when, they were talking about receiving public assistance?
They were actually, it's kind of like what registration used to be like for us at the beginning of the semester, right? They were kind of in a large room filling out forms.
They're outside. I mean,
Oh.
It's not like you're getting a check in the mail, right? It's
Okay.
Again, it's a public punitive thing. In a lot of cities, you had to stand outside in front of the courthouse to get your food aid. You had to stand, in a public line to get the public assistance. So as we saw, they had to carry, a bin to get public assistance, or they're carrying a bag of food. And so there's also this kind of punitive public enactment of, see, you are a dependent person, and we, the white people in authority, on the one hand, aren't we being benevolent in taking care of you? And on the other hand, look what's happening. We're having to still provide for you. So, so we see in the beginning each of these ways in which that hierarchy is being publicly enacted.
Jennifer, we have two questions, and I just want to know, the first one is about why union membership is in decline. Do you want to take that now? Do you want to sort of?
No, I think we need to try to understand, first of all, the union story here, and the union, ultimately the union victory, what the strike meant to people socially and what the union meant to people socially and politically, before we can answer that question. Okay. Because there's just an awful lot between 1968 and now. But I think what we should do is start to think about the work and how the work that these men were doing was a racializing project, I guess, or a racializing process. And let's try to think about the experience of the work, again, the kind of political and social meanings that emanated from the work they were doing and the way it was structured, and why they start to take the actions they do in the 60s.
Isaiah, you had your hand up. Do you want to speak to that?
Well, my question was that, in the film, the mayor keeps saying that their action going on strike is illegal. And I'm just wondering about, what, I'm presuming it was a city statute that made it illegal. Maybe it was a state statute that made it illegal for them to go on strike or to organize. And Jennifer, you addressed this partially by saying that they weren't covered by a number of public statutes that came more to the fore after that. I mean, but my impression, didn't you say New Deal? I mean, that was the 30s. It should have been before this.
Well, it's the New Deal that legalizes unionism and collective bargaining. So,
But it
So
didn't
the
apply to
reason-
public workers?
No,
And did it get extended to public workers sometime between
at
68
the
and
state,
now?
so at the state level, it depended on states passing such legislation. But the other thing is, so first of all, if we think, I mean, the New Deal is the pivot for all of this, right? There is no minimum wage before the New Deal. It's the New Deal Fair Labor Standards Act that created the minimum wage. It's the Fair Labor Standards Act that creates the whole idea that there is a 40-hour work week. That's gonna, that there is a limit to the work week. And if the boss is gonna force you to work longer than that, then there will have to be compensation at time and a half for that. So our whole understanding of standardized employment and the benefits that come with employment emerged from that moment of the 1930s. And also, of course, Social Security. The act that creates Social Security pensions also created unemployment compensation. So these workers were not covered by any of that. Now, there were states that could do a couple of things. They could increase their own minimum wage, which we see as a case. There were states that eventually in the 1960s started to allow public sector collective bargaining, or cities could recognize that. I mean, there could be cities like in New York where they could say, all right, we are going to engage in collective bargaining with our workers. But there were also states that passed laws that said, if public sector workers go on strike, that is illegal and you can serve jail time for that, which New York also had that law as well. So New York had the Condon-Wadlin Acts. So it could be that, well, Tennessee was probably a right to work state. Somebody can look that up and see what year Tennessee enacted a right to work law, is my guess. But the state might have had a piece of legislation that said a public sector strike will result in arrests and going to jail. They might not have. They might have just been messing with Black people, which we can see they did.
On that subject, I was listening to a program on NPR this week on the minimum wage, and it pointed out that the deal that was made to get the minimum wage through with New Deal Democrats included a provision that the Southern Democrats demanded that agricultural workers and domestic workers would not be covered by it. And to me, that exactly parallels the comment that the sanitation workers were all Black, and that that was probably not official but absolute. So, and that's what the Southern lawmakers said. If you're going to have agricultural and domestic workers are Black, and agricultural workers also Hispanic, and you can't give them the same wages as whites.
Yeah, this is really important, actually, if we want to think about structural economic inequality over time, because the Social Security Act also included the same deal, that in order to get the Southern Democrats to sign on to the Social Security Act, they also made the deal that domestic workers and agricultural workers would not be included. And the same thing was true for the Fair Labor Standards Act. So, so we have, at the very inception the welfare state, which was meant to provide, these new rights to economic security, new measures for economic security, Blacks just get cut right out of the deal, and especially Black women. And so if we think about, the welfare state over the period, just say from the 1930s and 40s up to the 1970s, housing, housing mortgage subsidies and support, pensions, unemployment compensation, the support for collective bargaining, the minimum wage, overtime compensation, those actually primarily benefited white men. And so the discourse, though, that emerges in the 1960s and 70s is that, again, this very vitriolic kind of racial language about, these Blacks are taking advantage of the welfare state, and Black women are dependent on the welfare state, when in fact the primary benefits over all those decades had actually gone to white men. Black women were especially cut out of the labor legislation and the social insurance support. And in the beginning, it's not just that agricultural workers and domestic workers were excluded, but also public workers, people who worked in nonprofit settings. So if you worked in a hospital, you were cut out, and a lot of the service sectors were cut out also. So, so the fight over the next several years is about inclusion into that. Gradually, as through organizing, agricultural workers gained inclusion, and it takes up until the 70s for domestic workers and nursing home workers to gain inclusion in these. But actually, home care workers, who I've written about, did not get included in the amendments to the Fair Labor Standards Act in the 1970s, and so continued to be outside of these protections, even though, in fact, by the end of the 20th century, this was the largest growing workforce, or one of the largest growing workforces in the country, and indeed at the present has more workers in it than auto, steel, and like electrical combined. So so what is it, as again, thinking about the working conditions of these of the men in Memphis and sanitation, what is it that drives them to take action and to do so in the particular way that they do? Rachel?
Well, the filmmaker makes the point that what prompted them finally to strike is the death of two of their comrades, that the short circuit on the truck, and the realization that none of them had any kind of workman's compensation, none of them have any life insurance, and these trucks are not maintained properly. So there had been an attempt at a strike, and then they had given up on that because of massive intimidation being put upon them, and then returned to work, and amazingly did that strike without any labor organizers coming in to assist them. They had already started the strike before outside people came in to help them do it. And it's really phenomenal to see how well they organized themselves, how well they organized food distributions to help the families of the strikers. Really quite amazing to watch.
And I should say, actually, during World War II, when a lot of rural African-American migrants came into Memphis. This was a time when they could start to get more jobs, that there was more organizing going on, and also a really active left. And so there was an alliance of kind of Black organizing, labor organizing, and the left that had been emergent and growing in Memphis. And then with the Red Scare of the late 1940s and early 1950s, a lot of the leftists were chased out. And we can see even through this film, I mean, it remains a tactic in the South that whenever Blacks start to organize, you can just red bait them and just say, no, oh, this is clearly the communists. If they're organizing a union, this is definitely the communists. And of course, the Communist Party line calls for racial equality. And so if the Communist Party line calls for racial equality, and these people are calling for racial equality, then obviously this is a communist conspiracy. And so that is also how CIO unionism was defeated in the South in the late 1940s. In the 50s. And so now they're kind of picking up a generation later in the 60s and trying to figure out, okay, how do we, rebuild again, especially now that there's a civil rights movement in motion around them. And I would say actually, Rachel, on the death of those workers in the truck, and they're talking about how they don't have any compensation for this whatsoever. I also think it symbolized something even deeper for them. Yeah, Carol.
I think so too. They were as good as garbage, they actually, there was a union guy down there trying to get them to strike, and they wouldn't. But until this death, then they just spontaneously, these deaths, they just walked out, and it escalated, and the whole town, the whole city, I guess, well, that's the African American section of Memphis, shuttered itself after a while when they weren't getting any attention from the mayor and the government. And also you were talking about the communist relationship, or that in people's minds about labor unions and race and communism. At the same time, Martin Luther King was under investigation by the FBI, by J. Edgar Hoover, who was out to get him, basically. And that was also very, very powerful. And sometimes, yeah. I just want to say, I think the whole film was really about the labor movement. That Martin Luther King's part in it was so key and so central, and it was such really good footage of the last weeks of his life. But it was held together by the story of the labor movement in Memphis.
Well, that's what I think when we think about how historical change happens is so significant about this film, because we see the social struggle happening among the working class people. Martin Luther King doesn't make an appearance until 90% of the way through the story. And so it's not as though a big national leader just kind of swoops in and creates this scenario that, as Rachel was saying, they took this action independently and started to get organized. And as Carol was saying, yeah, the significance of it being sanitation work and the way in which that first of all, could be used as a racializing thing, is to, okay, we're going to make only Black people do this job. And if the job involves refuse and dirt and decaying substances, one of the guys was saying like there were maggots, in everything we were throwing away. So you have like decay and refuse and dirt and fluids, that this then would be projected onto the workers, and they get associated with that. Like, this is the labor that they should be doing. And so I think it's important to recognize that kind of cultural or ideological process of connecting certain kinds of labor with creating race. And then as Carol was saying, the fact that they could be killed is like, yeah, they're just disposable because they had raised the safety issue multiple times and it just wasn't important enough to address. And so they are not really people worth protecting. They're disposable. And so to come back to the connection then between, the taking the action of the strike and walking out and then trying to figure out what to do. So they all come into, oh yeah, thank you, Sarah, right. Disposable in terms of trash, but also disposable in terms of, we always have a surplus of cheap labor out there, and making sure that surplus of cheap labor always exists. So they go on strike. And again, another powerful scene for me was when Jerry Worf, who was head of AFSCME, he's this Jewish New Yorker, and he comes down there and he's thinking, all right, I'm just going to settle this thing. These guys can't just go on strike, like, let's just settle this. It was a wildcat. They were upset, but we'll calm everything down. We can't have, just like these passionate outbursts, So I'm going to come down there and settle it and take care of everything. And what happens actually when he's there? Yeah.
Well, they lie to him. They tell him that they're going to adopt this resolution to negotiate, and one day, and then the next day they refuse to do it, and they make him look the fool to the union or to the workers, because there is no union really. I mean, it's like they walked off and went on strike without a union. The union was never recognized there until after this. And it's very striking that he doesn't get anywhere with that. He gets some lip service from the town council, but then he doesn't get anywhere. The other thing that I found very striking, just to use a bad pun, was that when they decided to fire everybody and replace them, it's not Black workers who come in, it's white workers. It's poor white men who come in to replace them, and I'm sure that the city got them to come in and take these positions saying, we've got to put down these Black guys. And the poor whites were more than willing to do that and get paid for it. Because, I lived in Memphis. I moved to Memphis 12 years later in 1980. I lived there from 80 to 82. And it was better than it probably was in 68, but it was unbelievably racially separated. Blacks and whites hardly ever did anything together, but I was playing music with Black people at Memphis State and around town. And, but the most ironic thing was there was a graduate student, a white man studying jazz piano and jazz composition. And he and his wife at lunchtime in the faculty lounge at Memphis State would talk about where the French were moving. And that was their code word for Blacks. And what neighborhoods were going downhill because of that. And I'm thinking, what sort of a sham are you, playing African American music and making that your work, but not wanting to live near them or have anything to do with them? It was so just, it was distressing to see that sort of racial bias within someone who ought to have been much more sensitive to Black issues and Black music.
Housing is the.
And we have a question from Carl. Was there any Jewish involvement in Memphis as there was in other civil rights locations?
Yes, although some of them were with the left and red baited in the later 40s and left. But I'm trying to think about Christina Green's book. And I suspect that there was a greater involvement even beyond that period of the early 50s. But I also thought that, when, even beyond how Jerry Worf perceived his own personal treatment when he was in Memphis. I think, what was, I think, this kind of light bulb moment for him when he went down there? Because I think he thought, what are these guys doing? Just like walking out, as you were saying, they have no structure, they have no plan, you got a plan for a strike. So let's just, put in place a procedure and get them back to work. And it becomes like a real turnaround moment that I thought was, well, Shoshana?
Well, I was going to say, it's in the film, I feel like there was literally a moment when he kind of accidentally dove in, when he was speaking and he got really caught up in it. And he went from being, we have to try to make this work the usual way, to like, you're just screwing up left and right, and you cannot treat people this way. And I wonder if part of what he was thinking, one of the things that I thought when I watched this was, it was very reminiscent of movies I've seen about the 30s and workers, the beginnings of union movement in the United States, which was also somewhat disorganized or not quite organized yet. And maybe he was thinking, well, this is how it starts sometimes, even though they're not following the rules, they're clearly right. And I'm going to put myself on the side of right. But you could kind of see it happen in the movie. I mean, I don't know how they got the footage they got, because there were a couple of moments in the film that were just sort of iconic that way. Like, you couldn't have scripted it better, because he's just very passionately speaking, and he's not even that articulate, but you can feel the emotion and how the outrage that he's experiencing from what he's seeing.
Yeah, I think because you get both the political arena as well as the workplace. They go to the public hearing, and he's able to see how they're treated as second-class citizens. Like, why are you people even here? What made you people think you were going to get a public hearing? What made you people think you were going to get due process? And it does seem to be this light bulb moment where it becomes really clear to him that it is about them being just so treated as second-class citizens, not having the basic rights of citizenship or respect or dignity. And so then there is that amazing moment where, instead of saying get back to work, he says, I will stand with you no matter how long you are on strike. I will absolutely stand with you to the end, and we will fight this fight alongside you to the absolute end. And so it was this just click of recognition that it's as much a fight about citizenship and civil rights as it is about the wages and the working conditions. And Carl, interestingly, we were just reading in my class today about Miami, where Jews were involved in the civil rights activism there and labor, especially because a lot of them had moved from New York and had been part of the ILGWU, and same with the Puerto Ricans who were in Miami. And then also in Los Angeles, where because the major groups in Los Angeles were Japanese Americans, Mexican Americans, Jews, and Chinese, you had this very multi-ethnic city, but nobody was a majority minority. And so the only way that any of them could accomplish their goals was through a coalition. So in some cases, it was because they faced the same kinds of discrimination. You know, Jews, as well as Blacks and Mexicans, faced housing discrimination through restrictive covenants. They faced employment discrimination. In other cases, it was, you know, Mexicans and Japanese who faced police brutality, but none of them were going to be able to tackle any of those issues on their own. And so in LA, you have a really unique multi-ethnic civil rights coalition for a while.
Now, I was just curious about, you know, we hear a lot of places where these civil rights struggles were taking place. I mean, we did see there Black and white ministers and priests, and they were standing up. And I was just wondering whether the Jewish community, whether rabbis in the community, there were, I'm sure,
Right.
where they stood on these issues, or if they were not in any way involved in Memphis. It seemed like it was pretty central to what was going on in the civil rights movement at that particular moment. And even Jews would come down from the north. They would come down.
Yes, in fact, huge busloads of people did come down from the north.
Yeah, it's interesting.
Harriet, I don't know the answer to that.
There's an interesting dimension that Mayor Loeb is from an old German Jewish family.
Wow. Okay.
Since 1865, but his mother is Roman Catholic, an Irish Catholic. But that adds a kind of an interesting dimension. His, you know, it's sort of for him. There's a dimension of proving himself as part of this, you know,
Yeah,
plantation society. And I saw in Louisville something similar. Louisville is another city, another southern city that integrated without any difficulty. They had an exhibit in the main fire department of integrating the fire department, and it was basically just they integrated the fire department. There was no sort of theme to this exhibit. There was no tension. But part of the way that they were able to do that is that there was an overarching kind of oligarchy of, you know, there's, you know, the people who run everything, and they're able to dictate to the lower and middle class whites as well as to the blacks. You know, we're not going to have any problem in our town. You're not going to, you know, you're not going to cause any problems. I think that must have been an issue for Henry Loeb.
It similarly becomes an issue when you get the first generation of Black mayors in the 1970s.
Right.
And 80s, to what degree are they going to, be the, the big civil rights mayor who's going to, really turn up things upside down, or are they going to show the white power structure and especially the white financiers and bondholders and everything that, oh no, we are going to engage in fiscally responsible leadership. Rachel.
I was so distressed the first time I saw the film and I saw that this mayor was, Loeb, that I Googled him, right? I stopped watching the film and I Googled it just to see. And there's probably an interesting story in there. He, as was mentioned, as, he was born of a Jewish family, or a Jewish parent, father. He converted to the Episcopal Church somewhere, I guess, January 1968, as he was starting a second term, is what Wikipedia had said. I'm sure he was doing his best to, to get those standing ovations when he appeared at the Rotary Club, but just hideous behavior. Just when you watch the footage of Loeb and his just disdain and scorn and lack of acknowledgement of the humanity of the sanitation workers, it's really horrifying. So the small, the small victory for Judaism is when WRF comes in as the New York Jewish labor organizer to help out. Anyway, there must be a story in there about these Jewish guys going head to head.
Jennifer, I was wondering if I could stop being facilitator for a second and just chime in. Is that okay for 2 seconds?
Yeah.
So for me, the thing that resonated so powerfully was the sign, "I am a man."
Yeah, that was going to be my next topic anyway. So,
and I just was so blown away. It was such a simple sign, and yet it felt so powerful, so incredibly powerful. And it resonates all the way to today with Black Lives Matter. I was like, oh my God, we're having exactly the same conversation. Are they human? Are they like us? Are blacks and whites both the same kind of people? Are we both men? And it just blew me away.
Can I say something about that? My colleague Colette Gator, who's at the University of Delaware, and who's African American, and she teaches graphic design, etc. She did a presentation and led a panel about the graphic design of protest, and particularly people talked about that sign. And it's amazing because one of the things that the signs came out of was the fact that they were using grocery store, in the grocery stores, remember in the old days, like there'd be these people who would whip up signs really quickly for the prices in the grocery stores that would go in the windows. That was the midnight technology that was available to them. So it's just a kind of interesting thing of what in the pre-digital era, how something so powerful developed, and now everyone recognizes that as one of the most powerful signs that came up. I hope I had the story completely right.
I mean, so yeah, how do we get from, okay, our wages are really low on the job and our conditions are really unsafe, to this huge declaration, I am a man?
I mean, I don't think it takes a huge leap to go from, I don't make enough money to feed my family. When somebody gets hurt, nobody helps them. When they die, their family can't even afford to bury them. We are human like they are. Why are they treating us this way? You know what I mean? It seems to me like it's not a very, it's impressive that they said it out, out loud with their signs, but it's not surprising that what they were experiencing was, we are not being treated like humans. We are second class, whatever. To be able to say it and put it out there, super powerful.
We-
It seemed,
We've been
it,
spending a lot of time in this hour talking about the pluralistic attitude, treating them as underclass, plantation mentality. They got it and summed it up in that one song,
yeah,
the
right.
whole thing. Everything we've been talking about in the past hour.
I've got Carol and then Ruth and
Yeah.
then Sarah.
It seemed to me, I remember they said in the movie that it was one sign that somebody made, and then, so it wasn't organized, you know, we're going to do this. And it seems to me that maybe it came to somebody in the middle of the night, or, you know, before they woke up in the morning and just thought, you know, I'm a man. Why do I have to go through all this? So, and he made a sign and it took off like wildfire. It came from their heart. It came from their, so deep from their, in their experience, that it was so profound, I thought. Yeah.
Ruth? Come off mute, Ruth, please.
Mute, you're on mute.
Bob Dylan
Yeah.
got a song from I Am a Man, a great song from it.
Yeah.
Who did?
Bob Dylan, our Nobel Prize winner.
So I have a question, because the other thing, you know, the flip side of that I sometimes raise is, so it encompasses all these meanings of, you know, see me, recognize my humanity. I demand that my humanity be accounted for up front. That I have dignity and worth. But when it's so specifically said as I am a man, does that foreclose other meanings for women down the road? Does it define civil rights and human rights in very gendered ways that women would not have access to?
I think back in those days, people thought more of man as in the species. So mostly, I think, usually people would like, it was man the hunter, so as a species. So it wasn't quite as gendered. But I was going to say, we still have some of the same problems with recycling workers, particularly since they're often undocumented or migrants, or they used to be until we, you know, kind of lost all our recycling places. All just went overseas, but you know, they were expendable and asked to do a lot of things that were unsafe. Weren't sometimes they were given decent wages, but still a lot of problems with the workplace.
So Jennifer, we have a question here. I wanted to ask about demonstrations that started out peacefully and led to violence. What was the thin line that sort of tipped over, particularly at this point in the movement where you had a strong commitment to nonviolence, but Black Power also sort of rising at the same time?
Well, who wants to answer that?
Someone asked it, but no one is ready to answer.
Well, I mean, you know.
Who would like to answer it? Yes.
Yes, since everybody else watched the film too.
Isaiah has a comment.
My comment was going back to, oh, I'm muted. No, I'm unmuted.
No, you're not muted.
We can hear you.
It was back to Rabbi Astor's question about Jewish involvement in the strike. And I did a quick search, and there was a Rabbi James A. Wax who came to Memphis in 1946 as an assistant rabbi at Temple Israel, became head rabbi in 54, and at the time of the strike was president of the Memphis Ministers Association. And he served as a spiritual leader for the city, and he forced the city to negotiate with the workers. They wouldn't negotiate with the union, but the AFSCME, but they started talking with the workers at St. Mary's Episcopal Church, which was a meeting that was set up by the Ministers Association, which he was the president of. So we can be proud of his role in that.
Yes, Isaiah, he also had a major confrontation with the mayor, with the Jewish, so-called Jewish mayor.
Right.
And I quote him, he said, "Speak out in favor of human dignity for every person, wax told Loeb. Let us not hide behind legal technicalities. Let us not wrap ourselves up in slogans. Let us do the will of God for the good of the city." I think he was a pretty significant leader, and it doesn't surprise me that I mean, you almost every civil rights movement in this country had Jewish involvement in it and Jewish sacrificial involvement in it. And I think it's just important for us to note that, because that is it continues to this day. And I think something that not only we should be very proud of, but we should, I think it's an important part of our relationship with the Black community in so many ways.
I have a question and a comment. One is, was that statement after King died?
Yes, it was. That's correct.
So also there's, the way in which King's death kind of pushes this moral urgency.
Yeah, that's a very good point, Jennifer.
But one of the things that happens is when you have, from the 1930s, really, certainly in the 30s and 40s, and I'd say again into the early 50s, you had these anti-racism coalitions that Jews were part of. To some degree, these are blown apart by the Red Scare. But also, one of the things that began to stretch apart those civil rights alliances, either in the 50s or later in the 70s, is class. And so sometimes, as Jews found themselves more upwardly mobile, they weren't living in the same working class neighborhoods anymore. They weren't experiencing the same employment or employment or housing discrimination. They began to actually not see themselves as linked to those struggles. And so, now that we've grown up and lived in an era, defined by Jewish middle classness, and a lot of security among Jews, I think we also have to be conscious of not allowing that class divide to separate us from the civil rights and human rights.
Yeah, I think even worse than that. I mean, what you're saying is it was beyond that. I mean, I think probably, and I'm not an expert on this by any means, but I think they found that some of the owners of the slum living that they experienced were Jewish owners who were, I think that I even existed here in New Haven. So I mean, it's that.
Yeah.
That also was a difficult.
What was Julian Bond and SNCC picketing in Atlanta?
Yeah.
Rich's department store, owned by Adrian Rich's family. But I mean, among other institutions, obviously. So in thinking about, first of all, how this story plays out, well, the answer to the violence question, who was that?
Carmi Kostelitz, sorry.
Yes. And, oh yes, well, what was your read on it?
Can I say, I'm not sure if the question was very clear. Can you hear me?
Yes.
I was just wondering about it. There you have the demonstrations. Martin Luther King represents nonviolent, peaceful methods, but is like the contrast, you know? And then the protest did become violent, correct? When they took him,
Yeah.
and then they asked, and then they took him away from the crowd, and it just it was
Well,
really just
yeah.
stunning.
Well, look at, I mean, from the very first moment that the strike officially started, when Jerry Worf was there, when they decided they were going to march, they're just marching. And what happens? This enormous police presence shows up. And then they say, and then they just give the order to, you know, push into the crowd and raid them. So the first thing is like every single time they seem to go out on the street, the police are there to meet them with violence. And then, you know, besides the dramatic impact of the "I am a man" statement, what's the other dramatic impact of that visual image that we saw? As they're walking with their "I am a man" picket signs, what else is in the picture?
People breaking the windows?
Assault weapons, guns.
Bayonets. The
Bayonets.
military, right? They are walking past soldiers who are holding bayonets at them on one side, and tanks are rolling past them on the other side. I mean, tanks, you know, so they're met by the National Guard. So I think that the other thing that happens is, you know, there's this younger generation looking at it saying, okay, you're saying, let's have a dream. I believe in the dream. Let's, you know, be peaceful. And yet every time we go out there to try and achieve a result, we're actually met by the violence and repression of the state. I don't see anything changing. And so I think, you know, you're getting, you know, the rise of a new movement that's impatient, first of all, with the pace of change. And secondly, feeling like, well, if somebody's going to meet me with violence, am I just supposed to sit down and take it? And so I think, you know, what we see in Memphis is the you know, like the pressing together of these different tendencies happening at the same moment. Elsewhere, they're just like fragmenting, right? SNCC is fragmenting, SDS is fragmenting, these organizations are fragmenting as they see that the pace of change is slow. And as somebody raised in their question, is not getting to the economic. Okay, we can go to the water fountains now. We can use the bathroom at the bus stop. But why is it that our people are still sanitation workers, not making a subsistence wage? And so I think also, you know, how is it that you get to, again, that deep perpetuation of inequality that I think leads to the explosive situation?
I'm going to break in here because I want to be mindful, Jennifer, particularly of your time and energy, and because you've been so kind to do this, and I know that you have a lot going on. And it's almost 10 after 9. So maybe if we have one or two more comments, and then anything in closing that you want to say, Jennifer. And
can I just quickly introduce, because you know, Carol had brought this up earlier about you know, what was so revealing and illuminating about seeing the whole social struggle that African Americans were going through. And King shows up, you know, very late in the day in this struggle. And so, you know, just thinking about what's the meaning and significance of his presence there in April, or in the spring of 1968, and how we understand that piece of the story and its legacy. Is that okay if I put that in there?
Isaiah, did you want to say something?
Well, yeah, I mean, the comment about, how the violence develops is striking, because I was reading that article about Rabbi Wax and some of the parts of this situation in Memphis. And there's, it seems like the police pushed the violence to happen and were the cause of the violence. And it's interesting because I've heard so many reports about all of the demonstrations after George Floyd was killed in May, that, the police were in so many places instigating violence, pushing people to react violently so that they could then use all of their big guns and their big weapons to put it down. And it seems so sadly that things haven't changed a whole hell of a lot.
Actually, in seeing the I'm a man, picketers with the people with the bayonets and, the military there, it's almost like, something out of the late 19th century, although obviously you would not have had tanks, but, that kind of state power, and then, brought back again at this moment of Black insurgency. But, here's a question to wrestle with, really. I mean, one is always the question of leadership, charismatic leadership in a social movement. And Charles Payne makes a distinction between mobilizing and organizing. And mobilizing is, okay, a big leader is coming in to give a speech. You get a bunch of people to turn out, 1,000 people, whatever, 5,000, 10,000 people come hear this leader speak. He gives an inspiring speech, he leaves, and the mobilization is over and everyone goes home. Versus organizing, which is a day-to-day local task. Local leaders do that, local people, they bring people along, they engage them and make them active in their lives. And so how do we understand a moment like this where it's the men in the union who take on the struggle? The charismatic leader, Dr. King, does come. What pushes the change? Like, is it the fact that actually, yeah, he dies, he's a martyr in the cause there, and that's what finally forces everyone to accept the union? Or is it the long social struggle that people were leading? Yeah,
but it's like when so you have a mosque attack, and so everyone is outraged, and so people from all over come to support him. So it does help to have national attention, and that was what King showing up was putting national attention on the problem to help put the pressure on it. So it's not always bad. I mean, sometimes the things can get fixed with the national attention. So that this big charismatic leader coming in just helps make sure it's not just a little, every once in a while it makes the evening news for 20 seconds. Now it's going to be longer. Even before he was killed, it was starting to get people to outside Memphis to pay attention.
Or was before.
I kind of feel like something you said just made me think, even though King was a charismatic leader and, huge, he was also a man, and he was also Black, and now he's killed. And so in a way it makes him kind of like them while he's also an exalted leader. It really is almost like something out of the Torah. He's like he's a person, but he's bigger than a person, and he comes and his presence makes a difference, but he's martyred. And I think that must have just really made people super angry and like, look, he was a guy, he was a man, he was human, just like we are. We're all in this together. How can you do these things? How can these things happen on our watch?
He was losing control though of the nonviolent aspect.
I know, I know.
It really concerned him.
Well, because it was tough and because it's hard to fight tanks with nonviolence. I mean, it's not impossible.
That's
And I
what
know
he
that was,
wanted. He wanted the
know.
nonviolence.
I know he did.
And I mean, but to come back to something Carol had said earlier, I think it's one thing for us to take away that's so important is when we hear that King give that speech on the last night of his life, that I have seen the mountaintop. I may not get there with you, but I believe that you will get to the promised land. It's one of his most famous speeches. We all know it, but we rarely see it or hear it in context.
Mm-hmm.
And now it's been placed in context, and that context is a labor struggle. That context is a struggle for economic rights and economic inclusion and economic equity. And so I think that's what's really important for us to recognize in our own time. And that's one of the things we really gain by putting that speech back into its social historical context. So I think Cynthia.
Yes, Cynthia has a question.
Harriet did.
Oh,
Cynthia, then Harriet, and then I think we'll wrap it up.
It was me,
So I
it
just
was me
wanted to-
first,
Oh, you were
actually.
Turn quickly to what I said much earlier about the fact that today people can't make it without working without welfare either. And so have we in fact come full circle, or was progress made and then we've gone back, or just, I just want to throw it out there, but I also want to leave time for Harriet's question because I talked before. So
Well,
yes,
I just
progress was made, but now it's undone.
Yes, so, right. So that was my question in the very beginning, which is unions, I think, do serve to help bring livable wages to people. But still, I think they do. But it seems now it's a very anti-union society. And so what are we going to do? I guess that's what it just feels, I mean, there's a bit of history, but it's not, it's ongoing. And nothing changes unless there's some economic equality. I mean, I think my opinion is everything resides on that.
And we have to have a true political democracy, which we don't at the moment. I think things did change. And actually, I think one of the, upcoming schmoozes at some point should be to have Steve Weisner talk about the welfare rights cases and the anti-poverty cases, I think, and the Columbia Legal Clinic and those clinics that were doing those cases. I think that would be really fascinating to hear about both the rights that were gained for poor people and then how they get undone. But I do think that African Americans and women were able to move into new jobs. They were able to unionize in the service sector and the public sector. One of the things that was actually most important about the Great Society and is that it created all these public jobs that African Americans could move into that were actually higher quality public jobs in social services that became union jobs. But and then the movement to organize hospital workers, nursing home workers, and others. Here's what happens starting in the 1970s is the emergence of a quite illegal union busting management consulting industry. The United States is unique in that we have a multi-billion-dollar sector of the economy that is fully dedicated to what they call union avoidance, bringing scripts to business about here's how you can derail a union campaign, here's how you can coerce employees, here's how you can decertify a union if you have one. And most of this is perfectly legal. And this is why Amazon now is so blunt and open about what they do. They see all the intimidation tactics that they've been using as legal, as standard practice, because they are standard practice throughout the business world. You just hire law firms like the ones that Yale hires, Proskauer Rose, or you hire your management consulting firm, and they'll give you all the tactics to hold out. And so what I think that what makes the United States distinctive in terms of its union decline, I mean, other places have experienced it too because they've undone regulatory laws, but we have a huge sector of the economy fully dedicated to making sure that workers can't unionize. And during this Amazon campaign, I think one of the things that was so surprising, I don't know if any of you saw it because it was 2.5 minutes long, but President Biden gave a speech supporting the Amazon workers campaign. And he actually said, and the boss should not be engaging in any coercive or threatening or intimidating behavior. When was the last time any official called it what it is? That was decades ago. And so I think there's actually, whether that union vote comes out as a win or not, there is a slight corner that's been turned because we're actually having a discussion now about the legitimacy of management's anti-union tactics. And Amazon sounds like old, I know I'm taking up all this time, but Amazon sounds like old time Southerners, in fact, because if you listen to what their response is, they say, well, our people, they don't think that way. These are our people and outsiders have come in, but we really know how to take care of our people. And we know that they really love and appreciate us. And, we just take really good care of them. And it's like, this could be a Southern segregationist from the 1950s saying the same thing. And so that, I think, enables us to understand that history and our current moment. And given that most of those workers are African-American at that Alabama warehouse, they are very clear that for them, it's a civil rights struggle that's as much about respect and dignity and autonomy and self-determination as it is about wages and benefits.
Biden is also trying to increase the corporate taxes and the very wealthy. Lots of luck.
So it seems like this is a very hot topic and we might need another film and another discussion. So if people want to send me an email, if they have ideas of movies they've seen, or Jennifer, if you probably have more on your list, but we can keep this going. But I want to thank everybody for your participation. I want to welcome and say hello and goodbye to Carmi, who is with us from Temple Beth David in Cheshire. And
wow.
Yeah, so we're spreading out now. So
Very
we
nice.
appreciate that you came. Next week, we have a schmooze that is near and dear to my heart. John Weiser's father, also named John Weiser, is going to be doing a book talk with us on Wednesday evening, which is also Erev Yom HaShoah. And his book is about his experience with his family leaving Vienna in 1939 and coming to the US by way of Brazil. And it's based in part on his own memories, but also on letters that he found that his parents had written to each other and to other people looking for help because they were in such dire straits. And I think it's going to be a very interesting conversation. We're going to start the evening with by lighting candles and having a very short little, just in memory of those who died in the Holocaust. And then we'll celebrate those who survived, like John's dad. So I hope you'll join us next week, Wednesday evening at 8 o'clock. And it's always, as always, it's great to see everybody. And Chag Sameach.
Thank you,
Yeah.
Shoshana, for all your work in putting this together. And thank you, everybody, for coming.
Thank you, Jennifer.
Thank you, Shoshana.
Yeah,
And thank you,
Thank you,
John.
everybody.
They're yellow candles in
Yellow
the
candles,
synagogue.
yes, at synagogue that Mimi has left out on the table, I guess. And
Yeah.
you
Or
can come
purchase,
and,
or
I guess,
purchase.
yeah, so
Can
for
you-
purchase, but it's on
Can you go into the synagogue?
You can, I think you
Yeah.
can go into the lobby, get your candle and leave. Don't take any breaths in or out while you're, no, I'm just kidding. You can.
On Sunday morning, it's open on Saturday, although you shouldn't take from then. But also, I think on Sunday after Yom Tov, Monday night it should be open, right, for Mincha Mariv.
And when Peggy is there Monday, Wednesday,
Yeah,
Friday,
you can
if you
get
just
in,
ring
yeah.
the, email her to arrange a time and she'll actually have it right by the door for you.
Right.
And also, John, I just want to, and Carol's not here, but thank you for the incredible work your search committee just did. I mean, it looks really exciting. Just reading about the candidates was exciting. And so I wanted to thank you for the work that you've all done.
Thank you. I really appreciate it.
Yeah, thanks for all that work. Yeah.
Okay. Good night,
Thanks.
everybody.
Good night, Lila
Thank you so
Tov.
much, Jennifer. That was fantastic.
Good night.
Thanks. I'm
Very informative. Thank you.